Welcome to the Sundae Labs Cardano Voltaire workshop. Who here is familiar with SIP 1694? Who has like read it or kind of read Twitter threads about it?
Yeah.
Generally? Okay, cool. So we can skip that section. I wanted to kind of let this conversation go where it goes. So if there's a topic that like is completely unrelated that you want to talk about and that everybody's interested in, we can go with that. But absent that, like if I just kind of threw you all in the deep end, we'd probably just mill about and not get anything productive. So like a framing question, if there's no other kind of candidates, is one thing that's really important to me is measuring success, right? Because if you just do things, it's going to feel like you're productive, and you won't necessarily actually be productive. And especially with governance, that can be a really subtle topic. So I just kind of wanted to foster a discussion today about what it would mean for the Voltaire era to be successful, and how do we measure that, and how do we check in, how often should we check in, things like that. So I have some paper down there. If you want to pass this around. I can only find 3 pens, so I'll hope somebody has their own pen. But I guess before we get started, does that topic sound okay to everyone, or is there anything burning that you kind of would like to discuss instead?
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
The idea is to find out 3 entities that control the keys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea with Voltaire would be that that changes.
Yeah. So I'll just give a quick summary of SIP 1694. So the current state of the world is there are 7 kind of public keys that are hard-coded into the source code of the Cardano node. And a transaction that is signed with those keys is allowed to include an extra field in the transaction, and this is an update. So this could be a hard fork, like initiating a hard fork, or it could be updating protocol parameters. Or it could be a spend certificate, what's called an MIR certificate to withdraw from the treasury.
Yeah.
So like Catalyst funds, every time there's a round of Catalyst, they submit a transaction that withdraws, upcoming 50 million ADA from this kind of abstract treasury. So right now there's those 7 keys. 3 of them are held by the Cardano Foundation, 3 of them are held by IOG, 2 of them are held by the Cardano Foundation, 2 of them are held by Mergo. And so that is some amount of decentralization, because those are different entities. Sometimes they don't always get along. Generally they get along, but not necessarily as decentralized as kind of we've been promised, so to speak. So the idea of SIP 1694 is to move those specific actions into the hands of both Cardano token holders and stake pool operators. So in kind of after SIP 1694 gets adopted, anybody can submit on-chain a transaction that includes a proposal. A proposal can be something like, change this protocol parameter, right? And so it would actually be encoded into the transaction that the max block size is now 100 kilobytes instead of 88 kilobytes. Or the fee tax rate that goes into the treasury is now 25% instead of 20%. Or initiating a hard fork, or things like this. Once that proposal is on chain, anybody can register as what's called a DREP. I dramatically want them to change that terminology because it overlaps with Catalyst. But so the terminology I've been using is voter, right? So you can register as a voter, just like you can register your stake address. And then if you don't want to register as a voter, and all that governance stuff is too much noise for me, you can delegate your data to another voter. You can say, oh, they're voting on my behalf. And then as a voter, you can cast your vote for yes or no on all the proposals, right? So you can say, yes, I do think we should raise the protocol parameters, the block size up to 100 kilobytes, and no, I don't think we should increase the tax rate to 25%. Then there's some rules for how long it goes into effect, what thresholds of quorum that you need to reach, things like that. Some votes also include the SPOs, so the SPOs independently can vote on them with their delegated stake. And then once something has kind of reached its quorum threshold, to say, hey, okay, the people have voted for this, there is what's called a constitutional committee, which basically gets veto power, right? So the constitutional committee is intended to be people like IOG, Emergo, Cardano Foundation, DC Spark, Sundae Labs, kind of a diverse set of entities that could, pull that emergency brake and say, hey, the people are really not voting in their best interest. This violates the constitution of Cardano, and we're gonna veto that. And so after SIP 1694 is enacted, the constitutional committee is supposed to be elected, and then their first action is going to be to draft the constitution, which is the guiding principles that they're going to use to choose whether to enact or veto these proposals that get voted on by the community. That constitutional committee can be replaced at any time, either by themselves. They can say, hey, we're retiring, DC Spark is shutting down or whatever, and we're going to replace them with a different member, or just rotating our keys. Hey, these keys got compromised, we're going to rotate to these new ones. Or the community can vote for a motion of no confidence, which if it passes immediately it kicks all of the constitutional committee members out, and then you have to vote in a new constitutional committee. So that's the whirlwind tour of SIP 1694.
That's great. Thank you. I mean, because it is the context. For instance, the other workshops they're asking us about, like, what do you think the threshold for the zone? So I'm like, what? Come on. So I appreciate bringing out the context.
Now, there's a ton of details, so I would encourage, if you're interested in this stuff, to go read the SIP.
Yeah.
But that's like the framing device where you can understand what's going on.
So the constitutional committee.
Yeah.
You guys have some questions, I imagine, because I would love to know about that. There isn't one now. I mean, it's just those 7 entity keys that.
Yeah, so that's not even considered the constitutional committee.
Right.
Those are just considered the Genesis keys, they're called.
Genesis keys. Right.
It's been a little, so I actually haven't refreshed myself on if the SIP has been updated, but last time I read, it was not specified how the first constitutional committee is chosen.
Okay.
So that's kind of what one of the big things we'll decide in Edinburgh is the initial constitutional committee what we have now, IOG, Emergo, and the CF, or should we start with no constitutional committee and have the community vote one in, right? That could be a completely different set of people, or it could be those plus a few, or things like that. In practice, I would just expect to see those entities on that committee. They're very invested in Cardano. They've put a lot of work in. They have a lot of data to vote with.
Right.
So.
Okay. Yeah, that's
And hypothetically, how are those keys being passed around?
So right now, they were just hard coded into the code, and whoever's in charge of DevOps at those different organizations. I don't know the specifics. In SIP 1694, it wouldn't be the same keys. Those would basically stop working after a transitionary period, and it would be whoever gets elected. So the proposal for a new constitutional committee would be a list of public keys. You'd say, I want this public key to be able to veto or sign XYZ, right? And so there wouldn't be any passing keys around. It would just be
generated.
I would be campaigning. If Sundae Labs wanted to be on the constitutional committee, we're too busy, so don't expect that anytime soon. But if we wanted to be on the constitutional committee, we would generate keys, publish those, and say, hey, we're making a pitch for being included, and then there would be a proposal that says, hey, replace the constitutional committee set with X, Y, Z plus Sundae.
Right. And the D-Rep and voter, I like the idea of voter because I don't think we have to register as a Cardano D-Rep, a Voltaire D-Rep in order to vote. So we can vote as a single person,
Yeah.
or we can collect, or we can campaign.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of the controversy around this proposal has come from. There's kind of two sources of controversy. One is the idea of one data, one vote, right, is very controversial to people because it's, kind of reeks of, I forget the term
Pay
that,
to play.
what?
Pay to play.
Yeah, pay to play. There's like a specific term that means like governance by the wealthy.
Yeah, plutocracy.
Plutocracy, yeah. And so there's a lot of contention over that, but nobody, at least as far as I've seen, has an alternative, right? And so the idea is let's make iterative steps and improve from where we have, because right now, it's not even pay to play. It's, it's just dictatorship in a sense. So let's at least move the needle if we can.
Right. The other controversy?
Well, so the other response that I have to the plutocracy argument, and this is just my opinion, is, this isn't a world government. We're not deciding on people's health plans. We're not building roads. So I think the comparisons to,
And it's important to remember that we aren't a world government, and that like the sort of hyperbole, but the sort of like, oh, this is the biggest
drama,
thing,
yeah.
the drama around it. It's kind of like, oh, we can kind of tone down the drama. And that's why I like this sort of idea of iterating away from, like doing small steps that don't have such like a big thing. It would be great if we could test net Voltaire. I guess that's what Callous was kind of envisioned. It was like, okay, this is the beginning of the Voltaire era.
and they do plan to do a big test net for this, so.
Yeah. How so?
They plan to hard fork the test net and
and
vote.
do
Hold some big votes, yeah.
That makes me feel so much better. That makes me feel so better. And of course I would do that.
And
It's just general software.
one of the things that people have suggested is choosing the, running a vote on the test net for should we hard fork mainnet, right? Now, it's a little bit bootstrappy. It's a bit like,
hacky.
it's a bit of theater because at the end of the day, right now the Genesis keys can just initiate the hard fork anyway. But it is like a good way to get people engaged and testing the system and things like that. The other big controversy was in the way that it was originally worded, there was a lot of confusion on who could be DREPs. So a lot of people thought it was very exclusionary, where the only way I'll be able to participate is by delegating to somebody, and I want to vote directly. And so that's, the wording has been clarified a lot on that, and the thresholds and the target thresholds for how much data you need in order to become a voter have been made clear, right? Because people were thinking, can I only become a DREP if I have 10,000 data? Then it's pretty exclusionary, but it's 2 to 5 data is what people are thinking.
Okay.
And that's just to prevent on-chain spam.
Is the SIP 1694, is it changing now?
Yeah. So it's undergoing revisions as kind of they collect community feedback. So it's done several of those. Jared Cordovan from the Ledger team is kind of the one that does most of those changes.
On the GitHub.
On the GitHub, yeah.
Okay. I kind of want to bring that up now that I think about that. Because you can see where PRs or merge requests or whatever are happening.
Another point of clarity that I'm seeking is one of the questions that was on the IoT survey for the workshops, which was regarding compensation for DREPs. And I kind of tend to try to reserve my own opinion until I can steelman the case for and against, and I don't have clarity on either of those things.
Yeah.
But I've heard varying opinions, and one of them is that if you incentivize, if there's a financial incentive for DREPs that markets can form around DREP delegation, that is inherently negative. But again, I don't feel like I have clarity on the repercussions of that, and also I think this in some way ties back to kind of one Lovelace equals one vote, where debating whether or not that's fair. Maybe there's other mechanisms, like reputation or what have you. But again, I'm trying to reserve judgment until I can collect more information.
Yeah.
But it seems though that one Lovelace, one vote is so akin to this proof of stake that like that is so core to the system
Yeah.
that it is very natural, albeit potentially capitalist and bootstrap.
Yeah, so the strong argument against one coin, one vote is that choosing who builds blocks is very different from like deciding on economic policy. And so it's the same argument where we're saying real life government is very different from what we're talking about here, right? This isn't life or death stuff. At least, maybe Cardano becoming the operating system of the world, it could be long term, right? In terms of like if somebody votes to start reclaiming like old rewards like Ergo does, right? So like UTXOs that haven't been touched in 10 years, well, that might have been somebody's college savings, right? So like there's really big decisions that can dramatically impact people's lives in kind of a long-term vision of Cardano, but it's still not, deciding people's healthcare plans and, military budget spending and stuff. So the same argument where we're saying these two things are different applies here, where we're saying, selecting who chooses the lots is far more of a, security consensus argument, right? Whereas this is like a inclusion and representation domain, in a sense, right? And I personally am in favor of, if not one person, one vote, things like quadratic voting, where, okay, your ADA stake counts for less and less the more you have. It still counts for more, but it's diminishing returns. But without any strong, reliable, widely deployed system of identity in a decentralized way, then, the example that Charles gave in Denver was in Soviet Russia, the passport authority wielded a lot of power because they got to decide who was a citizen, right? And so without some proposal, some solution for how do you identify one person for that one vote, and people, have made proposals like, oh, does it matter, right? Like, are people actually going to split their wallet and go through the kind of rigmarole to do that? And the argument in that case is that if you allow people to split their wallets, then you're inherently giving more power to people who are deceptive, right? The people who are willing to, even if okay, trying to imagine somebody splitting their wallet into 10,000 different wallets to get 10,000 different votes, maybe that's, we're just being paranoid and it's okay to just let, people are gonna split their wallet 10 times, whatever, right? And anybody can do it, so maybe it's fair. That's kind of an argument I've seen. You're inherently biasing the system towards people who are prone to being deceptive, right? And so that's not a behavior that you want to incentivize. Back to the thing that you derep compensation. That's another thing that I can give the Steelman case for either side. So the Steelman case for compensating derep. So this is the idea of if I register as a voter and I get a bunch of delegations and I'm putting in a lot of effort to research each issue, do a bunch of simulation to decide, are we safe to bump this protocol parameter, right? Oh, if we bump the block size, it's going to impact propagation delay by this much. If I'm putting in effort to research and put out an opinion piece to explain to my delegators why I'm voting, that's a lot of work. And the kind of basic philosophy is work should be compensated, right? If you want people to be high quality DREPs, then pay them for that quality, right? The argument against, the Steelman case against is, as soon as you put incentives in there, you create a very, you can create very perverse incentives where oh, I'm a DREP and I'm a popularity contest, I'm gonna track as much delegation as I can, and then just like roll the dice for my votes. I'm not actually doing quality votes because I'm still getting compensated either way. There's no way that the ledger can tell, the quality of my output. And you start to run into things, I feel a little bit responsible for kind of opening Pandora's box with the notion of ISOs. Now everybody calls them ISPOs, but Sundae was, really led the charge on that. And at the time, it was like a very innocent, like, oh yeah, everybody can be involved. It's low risk, and now like they kind of just run wild, right? And so now, do you see IGOs, initial governance offerings, where people say, hey, delegate to me as a D-rep so I can get this incentive, and I'll give you a coin in return, right? So it creates this sort of really no, but that could happen, right? And so, do we want to create those perverse incentives, or do we want to let people self-select for the people who are passionate, right? If you're not getting compensated, then the people who are going through the effort to do it are going to be the ones that are kind of more altruistically or what's the word that I'm looking for? More motivated better, right? By better means and not by pure money, right? So I personally don't have an opinion on this.
Where do you see existing stakeholders who are getting on with them?
Potentially, yeah. So I don't know, where I stand on that issue, for example. But
Hey, D-reps, but those are two good steel man as opposed to the straw man. It's like these are the strong cases for and against. Scott, what do you think? Is that, I think that gives me some, oh right, you got on one side, the compensation perverse unintended consequences, the SBO, ISPO, and now initial governance offering. You can see that arc possibly happening. And then the other one is and it's one of the things that Hoskinson talked about was just hey, look, this should be a paid thing. It was kind of D-reps and pay and as a functional official unit of the Cardano blockchain was a initial sort of idea that was put out there, and now it's sort of oh, wait a minute.
Well, I think it has me wondering, so I tend to, if I'm just gonna, honestly say, which way I was leaning, I would tend to lean towards, work should be compensated. And it is work, it's not nothing. If you're working full time and you're doing, all this, technical analysis, knowledge work, you're doing that on the weekends, that's time you're not spending with your family and your kids. So, that sucks. And so, but then recognizing these risks of perverse incentives, I wonder then if the incentive mechanism can be extremely finely tuned, calibrated towards self-interested cooperation.
Yeah, so one of the things that was discussed at Denver with regards to that is one way to combat this the perverse incentives here, where it's I just want to get as much delegation as possible because it's increasing my reward, is to make it a flat rate, right? So you say, hey, being a D-rep, you get 500 data a month, and it's not going up, it's not going down, or whatever the numbers end up being, right? And so then, even the small D-reps are being compensated for their work, and they don't have to necessarily try to attract a bunch of delegation, right? Another kind of proposal that people floated was rather than baking it into the protocol. So maybe the protocol, because it has no way to enforce good or bad actors, right? The protocol can't tell the difference between somebody flipping a coin to vote and somebody putting in a bunch of research, right? Maybe it's a callous proposal where you make a proposal to say, hey, these are the 100 best quality D-reps, let's pay them out of the treasury, right? And so then people can vote on that directly. And so there are solutions being explored. Honestly, I'm not an economics person, so It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
Something that really jumped out. I was reading the SIP late on Friday night, and I had this moment where it's reading one line and just really fixating on it. And it's it was that DREP can be a private key, but it can also be a script address.
Yeah.
And so to this point about an
That's
external
mechanism.
mechanism, an external mechanism to rank, DREP rank, and then compensate.
Mm-hmm.
You could have theoretically more complex mechanisms like accountability or another piece of software that is transparently and
So for example, one thing that Sundae Labs is considering is all of the ADA held in the Sundae estate or in the Sundae trading pools is ADA that is voting power. And so we plan to build into the next version of our contracts the ability for Sundae token holders to vote, for that vote to be rolled up, and then that vote to decide how the ADA in the state pools votes.
That is so awesome. Yes.
It almost kind of seems rather than a prescriptive approach, it might be better to say no compensation at the protocol level and leave this kind of open-ended to evolve naturally.
Yeah,
I think
at least at the start. That's what a lot of people proposed in Denver.
if people are putting in work, it has to be measurable work, right? You're taking from the community for yourself. And there are ways to show that you're, contributing as a DREP, right? Are you hosting meetings that are recorded and given to the community? Are you giving open source code to the community? These may not necessarily have to do with governance, but as a DREP, there could be some really standard or basic courses that if you're checking in and you're completing these trainings, or if you're doing these things, maybe you can be compensated as provable work in some cases.
And the big difficulty there is many of those are very difficult to prove at the ledger level, right? Because it's are we measuring based on the proposals or the justifications that you attach to your votes? Well, what if someone just puts 64 kilobytes of random data, right? There's no way to measure the quality of that. And so that's why I like making compensation a social layer, where we say, okay, we're going to compensate people, but we're going to let that rise naturally from callous proposals or these script DREPs, script voters, is really interesting.
Voters can be anonymous, right? Completely anonymous.
Yeah, so a voter or a DREP is just a stage address, right? Now, if you're holding the Pi ADA handle, obviously you're less anonymous, but there's nothing that the ledger can do to enforce that there is.
Do you have it?
Do
you have it?
Yeah. It was a gift to me when I joined the ADA handle board. So.
Big votes on are little inconsequential, but not small consequence, not inconsequence. It's this will be, for instance, in Callous, we used to all vote on making the facilitator was this guy Door, and he made this agreement with you guys give me a phrase and I will say it at the end of every thing, and so we'd all get together and sort of vote. Come to a consensus of what we wanted to say. It's wave bumper about, say stupid stuff. But it was this weird group governance action to and he would go for it. We don't do that anymore. And now,
Did you put in your
we do.
I have a question. What do you send after this to IOG or whatever? How do we collect the information that we discussed today?
I'll collect the notes and I'll kind of distill it up into a write-up. I haven't looked at that in a specific format, but I will also be. We kicked off the day with kind of a very deep dive into what SIP 1694 is, what it would look like, kind of in reality to somebody using it. But now let's talk about what are some ideas of what does success look like? And what I'm looking for here specifically is like, what I would like to come up with is a list of concrete measurements that we can take, either very objective measurements like voter turnout or participation, or like subjective measurements like community polling and sentiment analysis. But what are the ways that we're going to actually measure our success? That's probably a good place to start. What is success? What are the dimensions which we want to do well on?
As seen versus constitution.
So, like, is that a question or is it like suggested success metric?
That's a question. Where would you be measuring? Or-
That's another thing that we'll need to answer is like when and how frequently, right? So before we get to that question, because that'll probably be different per metric, right? Some can be measured in real time, some will be like every 6 months, whatever. But like, what does success look like?
I think one that everyone could agree on is the longevity of the treasury.
Okay, so like treasury longevity, and we'll dig into that kind of through the rest of the day of like, okay, but what specifically does that mean?
Right.
What are some other?
Well, yeah, voter turnout, like number of, percentage of people that vote. And then there's sort of objective and some, because that could be a number, but then it also could be like people, like engagement metrics,
Okay, so like voter turnout and
There
engagement.
you go, perfect.
And voter satisfaction of
Okay, so like satisfaction, or I'll also call this like representation. So like how well representation. How well is the on-chain voting actually matching kind of what people want?
Accessibility.
Okay. Just say accessibility and tooling.
Just the ability for folks to do it.
Yeah, like how easy is it to vote, to understand what votes your direct is cast, and things like that.
they're increasing their bad
So like, bad actors / accountability. It may be the same thing, but I'm also gonna write down like security.
Yeah.
Security and scalability of the blockchain itself, right? Because we're going to be updating parameters. So is that increasing the amount of economic activity we can support on chain, or is it decreasing over time, or is it, I'm going to put one kind of up related to this, like ROI. So not just how long is our treasury to last us, but like what kind of economic value are we getting out of that, right? If we, the treasury is kind of like a stimulus. So, is that returning value in whatever way to the Cardano community?
As a Sundae swap, I'm sure you have proposals that you already have in mind that you'd like to implement in terms of like changing the protocol. Is that part of the ROI? Would you measure that as part of the ROI? If the blockchain adopts measures to make your life easier as a DAO.
Yeah, so for example, one of the things that we would like to propose is increasing, the execution units, memory and CPU, because that means that we can fit more and bigger scoop transactions and process more user orders, like a higher throughput. And that applies to kind of a bunch of different protocols. So yeah, I would consider that either like scalability or like ROI. This could also be like, DC Spark has taken some of their like funding and like tried to give it back to the treasury, right? So like, you could imagine catalyst proposals or treasury payout proposals that are for equity, right? Oh, now the treasury owns equity in this protocol, right? Oh, if you give us 1 million ADA, we'll give you 10 million Sundae that is owned by the treasury. Now that's currently not supported in the protocol, but like that's another kind of dimension that we might be thinking on. It's like, is the treasury like literally growing from these investments?
Like, okay, yeah. It's sort of like a DeFi. From what I understand, what DeFi is, like it's like the treasury itself becomes a DeFi participant, or okay, that's like scalability ROI. Other ways to measure success.
Overall usage.
Yeah, we have like
Voter turnout.
and engagement, but like
apart from voting, if there are more transactions.
Right.
yeah, so like voter. So I'll just change this to governance turnout, and then through the rest of the day, we're going to break these down into like smaller categories and individual metrics.
Nice.
But what I will add in here is kind of the counterpoint to this is like spam, right? So we're going to want to be like, this is almost like a dimension of non-success, right? How much spam is entering into the system?
I think just like anything that we might start talking about now might jump into subcategories. Just for me, I think we're pretty much out, but I mean, I think I
got one more, and maybe it kind of goes under here, but like toxicity.
Yes.
So like, is the Cardano community, as a result of debating all the time, is it becoming more toxic? Or are we getting better at like having good faith debate between people, right? I think that's a really important success metric that isn't directly represented, right? If we tear ourselves apart, like the Bitcoin community like has several times, that's not great, right?
I wonder, like, kind of going back to the idea of like the adoption and the universal, like the number of users like on chain.
Yeah, so maybe
Is the
adoption.
system growing? Because I think we all kind of want it to grow, and so is governance like furthering that?
Yeah.
Adoption.
And that's like, kind of tied with scalability, but like you could, like for example, Solana has super high transaction throughput because they count their like every network packet as a transaction, right? And so you can scale, but like, is that real scaling from actual adoption, or is it like, oh, we're just pushing more bytes around?
And I kind of like trying to formulate an idea around like, like measuring if the outcome was what we intended, or another way to say it would be like, were there unintended consequences? So like, how can you measure the unintended consequences of, say, a governance action?
Yeah.
That's like a very vague idea.
Yeah, so that's like a little bit aligned with ROI, and I'm kind of just clustering these,
Yeah.
but that's like outcome alignment.
Yeah, like in, I think it's often the hardest thing to actually make sure that it happens. It's often like you pre-ideate and then you work through something and you apply it, and then that's it. And coming back and like doing like a formal analysis.
Right, like a retrospective.
I think an analogy might be in like building efficiency upgrades where you like you invest and then you look back and do like an analysis.
Another way to think this, or another kind of way that manifests is like measuring, like retrospectively, when I wrote this proposal, did that, like, are we getting people to include their, and clearly enunciate their intentions? I want to bump the protocol parameters, I want to bump the execution units so that blank. And then going back, like you were saying, and measuring, okay, this maybe this had an unintended consequence that was positive, but it didn't have the intended consequence, right? So, like, two vectors in kind of high-dimensional space, how aligned are they with the actual outcome, which may still be positive, and the intended outcome, right? And that's really important for like predictability, right? So that going forward, future proposals we can predict. Another thing that fits in there is like Callous sees this a lot with how many projects follow through. You know, they got the funding, did they deliver a protocol, right? And the impulse is going to be to dive into kind of subcategories, but I want to let this sit for a few minutes. Often I find like letting something sit in the awkwardness can like draw the last vestiges out of it.
Yeah. Another question: is there a place where debates will take place, or is it still just Twitter Spaces? Is there like centralized? This is where the steps are discussed, and this is where proposals are discussed.
Yeah, I mean, so right now the technical details of the proposals are really strongly driven towards GitHub, right? Because that's where the developers who are going to be the most contextualized, like, live, basically. And it's where, like, having that debate on GitHub produces an artifact that can then feed into a development team. But more and more, technical proposals are not going to be the only types of things, right? Like, oh, should we change our economic policy? Should we reduce the tax that we're collecting for the treasury? Should we increase it? Those aren't really technical proposals. You wouldn't make a SIP out of that, but they still do need discussion and vetting all that.
So yeah, that might be like, like where we're getting into like tooling and stuff.
Tooling, or maybe we need a category for like discussion diversity.
Oh, yeah. And now I can see.
And that's a little bit related to like satisfaction representation.
Yeah.
Discussion diversity. One really great thing to see out of this like workshop idea is a lot of like workshops in like Latin America and stuff, right? So are we getting, and that's what the like representation is like, are we getting representation from people all across the world, right? Is Hong Kong and Thailand and Latin America and the US and England and Russia and China all represented, New Zealand, Australia, Africa, all of the countries.
Time zones and languages.
Yeah. And that kind of also ties into accessibility too, really. One of the things we talked about in Denver was like one of the fields that you want to express on, because every proposal has like an anchor, we call it, which is a reference to something off chain. And that's where you can put like a justification and explanation for why you want this. And like one of the fields of metadata that we want in there is like language, right? So that it can like allow alternate translations and things like that.
Which is a sort of standard open source, thing. Like they have the languages or the localization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other like ways, like if you were to, skip forward 10 years, and you're like, wow, Voltaire has been really successful. Or, wow, Voltaire was like really big failure and I'm on a different chain now. What are those things? What do they look like?
More voters, more engagement.
Yeah.
I think just checks and balances. Bigger branches of this government.
But also actual progress, not just stalemates, like constant stalemates.
Mhm.
We don't do
Yeah, so like, I think there's like several categories here, but it's worth calling out as a dedicated one. So like, progress / anti-stalemates.
I like that. I mean, and that's the big. I mean, honestly, that's the big question. It's just like, is it work? I mean, is it working?
Yeah.
Um,
It kind of harkens back to like in the Ouroboros paper, one of the kind of key properties of a blockchain is liveness, right? We can create a global, totally consensus safe ledger that just has one block in it and never evolves, right? Of like, oh, this is the Genesis block, we all agree that's the Genesis block, we can't agree on what the next block is.
Liveness.
I think an idea would be like resistance to manipulation or something like that. And like the opposite of that would be like something along the lines of representation, also mixing ideas of security.
Yeah.
So like I'm thinking about the Supreme Court. Like I think if you polled Americans, I think most Americans don't feel represented by the Supreme Court. But the reason like why they don't feel represented is a little bit, it gets into like in the weeds on like technicals and like you know who appoints the judges, how many judges there are, and the overall like political environment. It's just like it gets into like the technicals of like the system that we're in, and so a lot of like what I think. So I think in the negative, it's like resistance to like tampering or manipulation or exploitation, and then in the affirmative, it would be like, does the system represent the people? So like, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of like cases that I haven't fully thought through. Like, you know, people talk about okay, yeah, Binance controls a certain percentage of the chain, so does Coinbase. Like, and in a proof of stake system, what if like JP Morgan just comes in with $2 billion and says we're gonna buy you all out? Like, I haven't really those are things that we talk about that get said, but I haven't really fully thought through like the implications.
Yeah.
You know, one might be in actually I like that the Supreme Court thing does this. You know, is it working as a, and that might go in like sort of engagement and stuff. But another one is like, does this become a model for other governance systems? You know, like does it, like in the open source way, will there be, you know, a Voltaire on other chains? Does it get better?
Or even like DeFi on Cardano, do any DAOs adopt this model, right? So I'm gonna call that like replication.
Yeah, which is different than adoption.
Yeah.
Adoption being like in our group, but then replication.
Yeah. While you were talking, I thought a really good one that's kind of captured by like satisfaction representation, but like confidence, right? Like not just am I happy with the outcome, but do I feel like my voice, you know, even if I'm not happy with the outcome, at least my voice was heard. At least I got to say my piece, you know, and it was fair. Yeah. So like confidence / fairness. Okay.
I have one more.
Yeah, sure.
Thinking about the idea of regulatory capture in like the United States government, if you make the analogy between